The first thing I saw was the collapse of my father's face. The pride, the military bearing, the unshakable confidence he wore like a uniform, it all just dissolved under the grand ballroom lights. The air grew heavy and silent, thick with the unasked question that hung over the heads of every admiral and decorated officer in the room. Then came the voice of the defense secretary, not loud, but so precise and cold it cut through everything. "Sir, that song belongs to Phantom Brigade." I watched him from my seat at the grand piano, my fingers still resting on the keys. My expression was a carefully constructed wall of neutrality, but behind it, my mind was racing. He saw a little girl playing a silly tune. They heard a ghost confirming its existence. In that single, frozen moment, my two worlds collided with the force of a tectonic plate shift, and I knew nothing would ever be the same again. 2 hours earlier, I was just a shadow at his side. I was standing with my father, retired Captain Robert Jensen, a man whose entire identity was welded to the Navy he used to know. He was holding court, his voice a familiar boom of old war stories and self-importance. When a rear admiral approached, my father gestured to me with a dismissive wave. "And this is my daughter, Sarah," he announced. "She works for the Navy, too. Pushes paper over at Fort Meade, good stable work. Keeps her out of trouble." He winked, and the admiral gave me a polite, slightly confused smile. I felt the familiar hot sting of humiliation, another entry in the long ledger of me being treated as a footnote in my own life. Later, after dinner, his mood turned performative. He spotted the piano on the small stage, and a cruel kind of glee lit up his eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen, a real treat," he bellowed, ensuring he had the attention of the surrounding tables. My daughter used to have a voice like a songbird. "Sarah, get up there. Give us a tune. Don't embarrass yourself." He laughed, and his friends laughed with him. It wasn't a request. It was a command wrapped in a joke, designed to remind everyone, including me, that I was his little girl, there for his entertainment. Hundreds of eyes turned to me, and I could feel the crushing weight of it all. His condescension, the public expectation, the years of being underestimated. He thought it was a harmless joke, another chance to treat me like the family footnote. He had no idea he'd just commanded me to break protocol in front of the entire naval chain of command. To understand the reckoning that followed, you have to understand the two lives I was living. To understand the wall of silence I built between my family and my work. You have to understand that there were really two versions of me. There was the family's version, quiet, disappointing, unremarkable Sarah, who was good with computers. And then there was the real me, the person who lived and breathed in the silent, refrigerated air of secure government facilities. The gap between those two people wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a carefully maintained operational secret. I remember one Thanksgiving, the whole house smelled of turkey and my father's overbearing pride. He stood at the head of the table, glass raised high, to toast my cousin David, who had just completed basic flight school. To David, my father boomed. A real Navy man, flying real jets, the tip of the spear. Everyone cheered, and David, bless his heart, soaked it all in. The praise was a thick, warm blanket, and I watched from the cold, feeling the familiar chill of my own invisibility. Later, during a lull in the conversation, I tried to bridge the gap. I tried to share a piece of my world. "I had some good news this week, actually," I said, my voice barely cutting through the post-dinner chatter. I passed my final signals analysis board. I didn't tell them it was a grueling 3-day oral examination in front of specialists who tried to break me, that passing it was the single hardest intellectual achievement of my life. I just offered up the headline, hoping for a sliver of acknowledgement. My father, who was halfway through a slice of pie, looked over and gave me a patronizing pat on my hand. "Oh, that's nice, dear. More charts and graphs? That's great." He turned back to my uncle. "Anyway, as I was saying about the F-35's thrust vectoring, the dismissal was so casual, so complete. My monumental victory was reduced to a clerical task." As he spoke, I didn't just feel this one slight. I felt the weight of all the others. The internal ledger recorded everything. I remembered the $5,000 he'd given my brother for a business idea that failed in 6 months while I'd worked 2 jobs in college to replace my own laptop. I saw all the years of money is tight and we have to support your brother's confidence laid bare. It was then that my mother, Eleanor, a woman who treated family peace like a religion and my father as its high priest, leaned over to me, Her whisper was laced with a familiar, gentle tyranny. "Don't compete, Sarah," she murmured, squeezing my arm. "Let the boys have their moment. You know how your father is." Her words weren't meant to comfort. They were meant to correct. They were a reminder of my role, to be quiet, to be small, to not make waves. To my father, I was Commander K-Board, a funny little nickname that felt less like affection and more like a brand seared into my skin. Now, let me show you my other life. Picture a room with no windows, buried so deep underground you can feel the weight of the earth above you. The only light is the cold blue glow of monitors, and the only sound is the constant low hum of servers and industrial air conditioners. This was my sanctuary. This was my real office. And in that room, I was not Commander K-Board. I was not small. I was standing in front of a panel of flag officers, the kind of men my father spoke of with reverent awe. I was younger then, but I felt ancient in that room. Among them was General Hale, a 4-star admiral whose tired eyes missed absolutely nothing. Behind me, a massive screen displayed not charts and graphs, but cascading lines of raw code, intercepted from a hostile nation's satellite network. It was a digital storm, a wall of noise designed to be impenetrable. I pointed to a specific sequence. "The chatter isn't noise," I said, my voice steady and clear. "It's a pattern. Their system is using a quantum-encrypted key, a very good one. But they made a mistake." I zoomed in on a flickering string of data. "There's a harmonic frequency in the static, a ghost signal. It's an algorithmic echo they didn't account for. I can use it to build a key. We can get inside." The silence that followed was nothing like the silence at the family dinner table. This was the silence of intense calculation. This was respect. General Hale leaned forward, his gaze locked on me. "Commander," he said, and the title was not a joke. It was a statement of fact. "Are you sure?" His question wasn't a challenge. It was the final check before unleashing a hurricane. I met his gaze without flinching. "I'm not guessing, General. I'm reading the music." That day, my analysis prevented a geopolitical crisis and led to the creation of a new, highly classified directorate. We didn't have an official name, but the intelligence community had whispers. They called us the Phantom Brigade. The music I read became the basis for our work. And the song my father forced me to sing at the gala? That was our anthem, our secret handshake. We called it the Minstrel's Key, a simple, haunting melody whose lyrics formed a mnemonic device. The very root of a decryption algorithm that could unlock our most secure communications. It was a living piece of classified information known to less than a dozen people on the planet. A secret that, by its very nature, guaranteed my own family would never truly know me. For years, I'd kept my world separate. I let them believe I was a glorified secretary because it was easier than explaining a job that, by law, I couldn't describe. But that night, my father wasn't just insulting me. He was ordering me to put the entire intelligence community at risk for a cheap laugh. He only respected the rules of his world, rank, protocol, and power. So I decided I would finally speak to them in the only language they understood. As my father stood there, grinning and gesturing toward the piano, a strange thing happened. The hot, familiar sting of humiliation that had been my constant companion for years began to cool. It receded, leaving behind something cold, quiet, and intensely clear. All the emotion drained out of me, and my training took its place. I saw the situation for what it was, a tactical problem. An emotional outburst would only prove his narrative that I was an overwrought child. Refusing his command in front of his peers would make me look stubborn and disrespectful. Both were losing moves. The only winning move was to redefine the terms of engagement. This would not be an argument, it would be a formal correction of the record. My eyes, which had been downcast just a moment before, lifted. I was no longer looking at a party, I was scanning a battlefield. My gaze swept past the smiling faces and landed on the head table. My mind, a machine trained for threat assessment, began to build a file. The Secretary of Defense. He'd been briefed on Phantom Brigade's second quarter operations just last month. The Chief of Naval Operations. He personally authorized Operation Silent Echo. And sitting right beside him was General Hale, my unit sponsor, and the man who had seen my potential all those years ago in that windowless room. The realization hit me with the force of an electric shock. My father, in his magnificent, blinding arrogance, had assembled the only jury in the world that could ever understand my testimony. The plan didn't form slowly, it simply appeared, fully formed and perfect. I could sing a show tune and play the part of the dutiful daughter. I could sing the Navy hymn and be the patriotic one. But both of those options were a form of surrender. No, I would perform the minstrel's key. To 99% of the room, it would be a strange, forgettable little folk song. But to that 1% at the head table, it would be the equivalent of me pulling the pin from a grenade in the dead center of the room. It was a monumental risk, a dance right on the edge of breaking protocol. But years of being made to feel small had finally pushed me past the point of caution. A calm settled over me. The tension in my shoulders eased, and I looked directly at my father. I even managed a small, serene smile. "Okay, Dad," I said, my voice perfectly even. "I'll sing for you." He beamed, thinking he'd won. He led me to the piano like a prize pony. He had no idea he wasn't leading me to a performance. He was leading me to a debriefing, and he was about to be the subject. I sat down at the piano, the polished wood cool beneath my fingertips. A respectful hush fell over the grand ballroom of the Navy Museum, the clinking of glasses and low hum of conversation dying out. My father stood beside the piano, his chest puffed out with pride. In his mind, this was his moment, a demonstration of his charming family for all his old colleagues to see. He gave me a little nod, a king granting his court jester permission to begin. I took a deep, steadying breath. It wasn't for nerves. It was the same breath I took in the silent moments before an operation went live. It was a breath to focus the mind. Then, I began to play. The melody was simple, almost a lullaby, but it was haunting. It echoed in the vast, high-ceilinged room, a thread of quiet sound in a sea of silence. My voice, when I began to sing, was not performative. It was clear, calm, and completely devoid of emotion. It was a recitation, a signal. The tide comes in on a moonless night. A few people smiled politely. My father beamed. The phantom watches with second sight. And that's when it started. At the head table, I saw General Hale, who had been swirling his brandy, freeze mid-motion. His hand stopped, the glass held perfectly still, his eyes locked on me. A few seats down, the Chief of Naval Operations, who was lifting a fork to his mouth, slowly lowered it until it clicked softly against his plate. The sound was like a hammer falling in the dead quiet. Their professional masks, the polite, detached expressions of men in power, had vanished. In their place was a look of stark, undiluted alarm. The jovial atmosphere of the gala didn't just fade, it was extinguished, snuffed out in an instant. I held their gazes as I sang the final lines, my voice never wavering. The silent bell tolls once for thee, but never tolls for you and me. The last note hung in the air for a moment and then faded away. The silence was absolute. It wasn't the silence of polite applause waiting to happen. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, thick with unspoken questions and the sudden, terrifying weight of authority. Time seemed to stretch, to warp. And then, the Secretary of Defense moved. He didn't just turn his head, he rotated his entire body in his chair. A slow, deliberate motion, until he was facing my father directly. He completely ignored me. To him, I was a known quantity. My father, however, he was an unknown variable that had just blundered into a minefield. When the secretary spoke, his voice was dangerously low, yet it carried across the entire room. "Captain Jensen." He used the retired rank with chilling formality. It was not an address between peers, it was a superior officer addressing a subordinate. "Where did your daughter learn that song?" My father, still blissfully, catastrophically oblivious, let out a nervous chuckle. "Oh, that," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "Just some silly ditty she made up years ago. She was always scribbling things down, that one." The words, meant to be charming and self-deprecating, sounded utterly idiotic in the crushing silence. They were the words of a man explaining a child's drawing to a panel of art critics. The secretary's face hardened, his eyes turning to chips of ice. "Sir," he said, and the single word was a direct contradiction, a formal rebuke of my father's entire statement. "That song belongs to Phantom Brigade." He paused, letting the name settle into the room. "It is a recognition signal for one of our most sensitive intelligence directorates. It is a piece of classified operational data." Another pause. This one even more damning. "It is not silly, and it is most certainly not made up." The color drained from my father's face. He looked like he'd been struck. "Phantom, Brigade? He stammered, the name catching in his throat like broken glass. I could see the gears turning in his mind. He was a Navy man. He knew the whispers, the ghost stories about the cyber warfare unit that fought, and won wars from windowless rooms, whose members were the unseen legends of the modern military. He looked from the furious, stone-cold face of the secretary to me, still sitting at the piano, and I saw it in his eyes. For the very first time in my life, he was truly seeing me. Not Sarah, not his little girl, not Commander Keyboard, but an officer, an operative. The dismissive nicknames, the condescending jokes, the years of being overlooked. I could see it all flashing behind his eyes, a lifetime of his own ignorance playing out in a horrifying montage. His body reacted before his mind could. The proud father vanished, and a lifetime of training took over. His back straightened, his shoulders squared, not in pride, but in the involuntary, rigid posture of a subordinate being dressed down by a vastly superior officer. My father had spent my entire life quizzing me on naval history and protocol. In the end, it only took 21 words for him to learn the most important rule: you never, ever compromise a ghost. In the ringing silence that followed the secretary's judgment, General Hale rose from his chair. He moved with the brisk, undeniable purpose of a man accustomed to taking control of chaotic situations. He didn't look at my father, he walked directly to me at the piano. His voice was low, urgent, and for my ears only. "Commander," he said, and the sound of my actual rank spoken so clearly. In that space was a final, definitive severing of the old reality. "Walk with me. Now." He placed a firm but not unkind hand on my elbow, and I stood. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an extraction. He steered me away from the piano, away from the wreckage of my family's perception. As we passed the head table, the Secretary of Defense met my eyes. He gave me a single, subtle nod. It wasn't an apology for the public mess. It was an acknowledgement, a sign of respect from one professional to another, a silent confirmation that a necessary, if painful, course correction had been made. I didn't resist. I let the general guide me toward the exit, toward my real world. I allowed myself one last glance back. My father was still standing there, a solitary island in the middle of the ballroom. The institution he had worshipped his entire life, the community whose respect he craved above all else, had collectively turned its back on him. No one would meet his eye. My mother stood beside him, looking small and lost, a citizen of a country whose government had just collapsed. A year can change everything. It can feel like a lifetime. The memory of that gala faded, not because it was forgotten, but because it was replaced by a new, more powerful reality. My new reality had a nameplate. It was on a polished wooden door in a quiet, secure corridor of the Pentagon. The cool brass letters spelled out my name, my rank, and my purpose. Director, Task Force 17, Phantom Brigade, CDR S. Jensen. Walking through that door each morning felt more like coming home than my childhood house ever had. Inside, there was no need for performance or justification. I was no longer the quiet observer hoping for a seat at the table. I was at the head of it. I would stand before a massive interactive screen, a global map alive with streams of data, and lead briefings with a team of the most brilliant analysts, operators, and engineers in the world. They were my people. Our interactions weren't governed by ego or family dynamics, but by a shared mission and a deep, implicit respect for competence. A question from my youngest analyst was considered with the same gravity as a suggestion from my deputy director. We spoke the same language, a complex shorthand of acronyms and operational theory. We were all reading the same music. This was my family, not one of blood, but one forged in the silent fire of competence. One night I was working late, the only light in my office coming from the glow of my monitor as I reviewed after-action reports from a recent operation. My phone buzzed on the desk, a small intrusion into the quiet focus of my work. I glanced at it and saw an email notification. The sender was my father. It was the first direct contact we'd had in a year. The subject line was blank. My finger hovered over the screen for a moment before I opened it. The message was short, stripped of all his usual bluster. It was the writing of a man who had finally run out of words. They told me about the commendation, it read. "Your mother and I, we are proud of you. I was wrong." I read the words once, then a second time. A younger version of me would have cried. A more bitter version might have felt a surge of triumph. But as I sat there, in the quiet heart of my own earned world, I felt a profound stillness. The internal ledger I had kept for so long was blank. The debts had been cleared, the account settled. His approval, the thing I had once unconsciously structured my entire life around, was now just data on a screen. It was information to be processed, nothing more. My peace was no longer contingent on his validation. My legacy was secure because I had built it myself. With a simple, deliberate tap of my finger, I moved the email to my archive folder. It wasn't an act of anger or forgiveness. It was just filing. I turned my full attention back to the glowing screen in front of me, back to the mission. I looked at the global threat matrix, a shimmering web of light and shadow stretching across continents. My own reflection was there, a faint ghost superimposed over the world, calm and focused. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. My father believed a legacy was something you pass down. I learned a true legacy is something you build in silence, and have acknowledged by the only people who matter. Sometimes the most important work goes unseen by the people closest to us. If you've ever had your expertise dismissed, only to be vindicated later, share your story in the comments below. In this community, your call sign is always respected.